Welcome everybody to this episode of Tech and Tonic. Today we have, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
My name is Dan DeBaun. Um, I'm I have several companies in the electromagnetic radiation space, providing products and services. We provide information about the current technologies and the implications to the human body. Um, my background is I used to be in telecom standards and testing,
Hmm.
and so have a rich history of technical background and experience. And maybe 15, 20 years ago, I began getting more concerned about the standards I was writing about, the potential human impact of electromagnetic radiation into the human body. Ironically, about 15, 20 years ago, I wrote all these standards. I had no real experience with understanding implications to the human body. Yet, even back then, we knew that after 3 to 4 hours, the male sperm was 25% of the male sperm was immobilized. And so I was sort of quite shocked that there seemed to be a whole lot of information about the radio frequency signal we were getting from our cell phones, our laptops, and tablets that actually were affecting our human body in a negative way. So that started our journey where we began educating and trying to understand the implications and trying to move forward with bringing solutions to the marketplace.
Hmm. So what would you say as a first question basically is how do you think EMF sort of impacts people?
So, great question. I love the question because um, I think back about 15, 20 years ago, and I used to talk about the electric hypersensitivity of the human body. And I used to refer to some science studies that talked about maybe 15, 20% of the human population was really affected in a negative way. You'd get headaches, maybe you're foggy thinking, maybe you weren't sleeping quite right. So there was at that time 15 to 20% evidence of the human body being impacted from that. Today, it's close to 50%. We find studies have shown that there's been more of a negative impact from the environment that's a growing and expanding world of exposures that we haven't seen in any of our lifetimes. So we have that part of the human body that's reacting. We have science that I study with Dr. Navio, who talks about cell danger response. And that's where the human body reacts to the exposure, the stressor. And there's metabolomic things that occur in the human body in response to that. And that's not even talking about, we know that there's the studies that show the frontal lobe after 3 to 4, after about up to 10 years of heavy use of a cell phone, you're roughly 3 times more likely to have a frontal lobe cancer. So it can get extreme where these exposures can very seriously impact our human body up to and including cancer, while at the same time, the more prominent problem seems to be the sensitivity of the human body is reacting to this environment. And it's just worse and worse and worse for all of us.
And do you think the latest introduction of, 5G technologies and the discussion of 6G technologies with millimeter waves, is that something that is causing this acceleration?
No, there's not enough deployment of that. So my suspicion is all the technologies that we're exposed to today
Hmm.
has grown and grown and grown over the last 5 to 10 years, and it's that exposure of a space we sort of pretty much well understand up to 4G. And now we're introducing what is referred to as the next generation, 5G. For your audience to understand, when you talk about the exposure, what is it we're talking about? We're talking about roughly a gigahertz of signal that is 1 billion cycles per second. And so we already are being exposed at 1 gigahertz, roughly, for most of the exposures. If you have a Wi-Fi in your room, you have 2.4 to 5.6 and 6 gigahertz. So you have all of a sudden these fairly fast signals already in our environment. Now, when you go from 4G up to 5G, you actually start dealing with many of the same frequency rates that exist today. And actually, believe it or not, slightly lower than the 1 gigahertz. They go below in the megahertz space. And that's where predominantly we see exposure today with fifth generation technologies. It turns out that with 5G, depending on where you are in the world, the 5G signal can go up to 100 gigahertz or 100 billion cycles per second. And that's the millimeter wave you were just talking about. But the millimeter waves, roughly in 5G, can go maybe up to 300 gigahertz. So there's very, very, very fast spaces. Now, what do I think about those? I think that it's not just the frequency rates that are being exposed. It is the power levels associated with those frequency rates that are unheard of.
Mhm.
In the US, for example, the standard by the FCC is 1.6 watts per kilogram. Your cell phone can generate a power level of 1.6 watts. When you have a fifth generation small cell site in front of your home that can only go 750 feet, they're transmitting at 20 gigahertz maybe, but at 40 watts. To get that signal that far away, they have to use so much more power to get that signal to the home that it's actually worse. So what you experience today may be influenced a little bit by 5G, but the major changes are when you get into the millimeter waves that I just said, the 20 gigahertz, and that can go up to, right now, up to 100 gigahertz.
Mhm. And do you think all of these telecom companies are aware of the damages that are being caused by these technologies?
No, not at all. Um, I think so many of them are engineers um, and experts in the telecom space where they like to see very clear evidence of what that science replicates in studies that are well founded, well run, statistically significant. And as you know, maybe it's not that obvious and that clear, even though we have a plethora, I mean, a plethora of studies at so many levels that says this is a damaging problem to the man. The telecommunications industry, they want to preserve their revenue stream. So they're not going to be talking about the potential of the damage because they make money on the service.
Do you think these telecom companies sort of fund research that sort of determines this as a safe technology? And there's like an imbalance of more funding for sort of proving this to be safe than there is to be unsafe.
Well, it turns out that in the US, there is no funding being spent on looking for the potential damage or the safety of cell phones.
Mhm.
That's ceased many years ago in the US. Internationally, in fact, I don't believe there's significant study work. There's some, but most of the work that we know of is independent study research. Like, for example, the US had a study about 10 years ago or so where where the epidemiology showed that there was a statistically significant increase in the heart and the frontal lobe cancers. And so that was done, and that was government operated, and even that was questioned by the US government itself. Although they funded it, they questioned it. Now, the Ramazzani Institute, which is out in Italy, did a similar epidemiology study. And they found it came to the same conclusions, that there was a clear evidence of statistically significant increase in frontal and heart cancers. And that was an independent study. So most of the study that's been done has really been independent. And when it is, almost always they find the damage. However, if there is study work by the governments themselves, or the standards bodies for that matter, they typically tend not to find a linkage between exposures.
That's a very interesting industry.
Yeah, they're a captive audience, is what they are. I mean, the standards bodies in the US and also in Europe as well, they actually typically come from the industry, the telecom industry. Like I'll talk about in the US a few years ago, the head of the cell phone consortium in the US ended up being the head of the standards, the FCC standards in the US that actually approved 5G. So to me, that was a bit more, there was a conflict of interest, in my opinion. Others think that as well. But in fact, that's sort of how the industries work. They're interactive with each other, and they're symbiotic to some extent.
When do you think was the last time all of these regulations were last reviewed to be,
Oh,
determined safe?
I'm very familiar with it, right? In 1996, in the US, for example, a standard was the 1.6 watts that I referred to before. That was the standard that was created 1996. And let me tell you how that actually was created. The FCC at that time looked at the data from the military, and they took on the average of a 6-foot male on the average, and they created a model of the resistive path of an RF signal to the head. And they determined that what they needed to worry about was the increase of temperature of a signal going into the head. That's sort of important. Our an RF signal is a microwave signal, and what it actually does is, like when you put a piece of meat into a microwave oven, that's 2.3 watts per kilogram, and a Wi-Fi is 2.4 watts per kilogram. It's identical signal rate, and the power levels are only different. So what they found is if they went above 1.6 watts, the temperature of the area that the cell phone was in would heat up more than 2 degrees. And that's what the standard was set at. And by the way, you may remember at that time, not many of us had cell phones. So you fast forward to today about that standard, and it roughly represents about 3% of the population. Women, children, teenagers. The population does not fit the model of the standard. And more importantly, the thermal increase in temperature, which was the standard, doesn't represent at all the implications to the human body. It's the biological impacts that we both read about in literature and science about the impacts to the human body. So we know for sure it is certainly outdated. It doesn't fit the user population. And in my opinion, you should be cautious about using it directly to your head for a very long extended period of time, because we know when you do heavy use, you're more likely to get a frontal lobe cancer than not.
And what do you think can be done to sort of update these regulations to be more present to what technologies are out there right now?
Well, that's a political question. I mean, there's no question about it. It depends on the government and their belief that there needs to be standards changed. We in the U.S., there's factions. There's independent science research groups that have actually lobbied the government in the U.S. and we lobbied European governments looking to try to bring more recent standards that better reflects the use and the technology being applied. So far, we've been unsuccessful, and I wouldn't plan on it. It's going to be a while that these standards remain in place, and there's not enough um, interest in the federal government in the governments to make changes to these standards, unfortunately.
Do you think people with EHS or basically this topic of EMF being harmful, it's being silenced? Because we actually started a petition not too long ago, and that petition got removed saying that the information is false, that
Yeah,
EHS doesn't
yeah,
exist. And we see
exactly.
that this is actually recognized by the WHO, and
Yeah,
we were sort of waiting for an appeal for that.
yeah. What's really interesting, the WHO recognizes a it's a potential it's category to be carcinogenic. That means it's a possible cancer-causing agent. When the WHO established that, they were looking for more testing that would more assure that the data was accurate, and they would have made it to A, which is a probable carcinogenic.
Mhm.
There was more than enough evidence today to make it to a category, and yet there's no interest in the WHO, the World Health Organization, to consider changing that from a 2B to a 2A. There's just no interest.
So what can an average person who is impacted by this and they want to sort of support this cause, what can they do?
Well, there are lots of things you can actually do to try to mitigate exposure. And I talk about time and distance. When you have a cell phone to your head, that's the highest probability of the potential dangers to the frontal lobe cell. If you take that same phone and move it um, a meter and a half away, almost around 4 foot, 98% of the power levels of that signal can't penetrate your head because the power levels have dropped so much. So simply by moving away from the signal, you actually help the potential dangers improve by that distance. Uh, for example, don't sit next to a router. If you have a router in another room, you're much better off than you are if it's in the same room you're in. So thinking about your environment, in fact, I talk about it in this way. You may want to think about your a bees in the room. A bee, one bee won't kill you unless you're allergic to them. 1,000 will. So what your goal is to remove as many of a transmitters in a room that most likely will influence you. And so by removing them, and distancing yourself from them, you really do reduce the potential risks to your human body. So if you use a cell phone and you use it a couple of minutes at a time, and then you put it away, you can use a cell phone for the rest of your life and likely you'll be fine. If you use it for an hour to 2 hours, maybe 3 to 4, that's the max of a when you're a heavy user of cell phones. That means it's likely true that you are 3 to 4 times more likely to have a cancerous event. And so that power is not good for the human body. Removing it into that space from where you are is the best. So you reduce the number of bees in the room. If you have a cell phone, you don't need a Bluetooth, a Wi-Fi, and a cell tower transmission. All you need is the cell phone if you want to keep that in your room. I never have those other transmitters on. By going from 3 to 1, 2/3 of the emissions in that room are eliminated simply by turning off those transmitters in my cell phone. And that goes for all your other technologies. If you have a laptop in your room and you're using a Wi-Fi and it's convenient enough for you, run an Ethernet cord. And that is substantially reducing your exposure simply by wiring your devices as you can to eliminate some of that exposure. So it's time distance. And it's also true that if you're going to be using technology around you like that, there are devices that are in the marketplace
Mhm.
where you can actually shield the cell phone transmitter that you're using to your head by having a device in between. Cell phone makers have shielding devices within the cover of the cell phone, and those kinds of things also help. So there are a lot of things you can do. Remove them from your life. If you use it, don't use it as much. And if you are going to use it, make sure you shield the signal from your body by using them.
And what about devices such as AirPods, which are
Oh,
people sort of have them for extended periods of time in their ears?
I know you didn't want to ask this question, but I got the answer for you. Um, and let's here's a little bit of the detail. A Bluetooth signal is about a cell phone is 1.6 watts, right? And a Bluetooth transmits at about 0.4 watts. So the power level is a third of a cell phone. Okay. When you have a cell phone to your head, a pod in your head, it's 0.4 watts transmitting. Well, we have science that shows 0.1 watts, 4 times lower power levels can influence the cell, the frontal lobe cell, and it can mutate that cell. And so, what do I think? I would never put an iPod in my ears. Not only will it have a pathway to the frontal lobe, but you have the vagus nerves. The pathway into the head is through your ears. I just think it's not the wisest thing to do, putting those in your ear and have them there constantly all day. It's crazy, in my opinion.
That being said, pretty much most of the wireless technology that we have currently is based on, EMF, and so what could be the alternative to that?
Um, it's fairly simple. You're the architect of your own destiny. You control the technologies around you. You control the things you choose and the things you don't choose to do. You can't expect government or any others to make sure you're safe in your environment. So I always recommend that what you do is be cautious about those technologies.
Mhm.
If you pick up your phone for a couple of minutes a day, you absolutely don't have to worry about anything. It's when you use it for hours at a time. If you use it for hours at a time, well, that means you probably want to shield it. because you've chosen to have a device near your head that is potentially dangerous to your human body. And so I actually suggest to everyone, you have to understand if you believe it's a problem or not. And if you do, you have the control of the actions that you can take to help minimize that exposure so you have less impact into your human body.
And if, for example, in the future there's a technology, wireless technology that's safer, do you think all of these technology companies, telecom companies, manufacturers, they would be interested in adopting something like that?
Maybe. Actually, right now, believe it or not, your Wi-Fi's in Europe transmit maybe at half the levels of the US. So believe it or not, you're less exposed than the US person. And that's a good thing. Can they go lower? They can. Can there be other technologies that can be improved, those exposures? And there are. You talk about optical communications. So they've been talking about that for a while, where they can have a directional optical link to the device you're using, and it can track you. It knows where you are, and it can communicate in a signal that doesn't have the RF influence on the human body. So there are ways of creating technology to by reducing the power levels, by changing the carrier uh, uh, um, frequency rates and the carrier themselves with another carrying device like a laser signal. And it's not laser, it's light. And so there are technologies that we know can be implemented that makes it better. And another one, of course, is that we know transmitters are very imprecise. And so there's actually ways of improving the transmitters and the receivers on devices that actually also would reduce the exposures. But they are very, very expensive. And so maybe with time, we may find that those changes can be implemented in a cost-effective way, and maybe those technologies will replace currently what we use in our technologies today.
Now, what about things like Elon Musk's Starlink? Now, that's something in orbit, and we're all being irradiated by that now.
Okay, yeah, that's fixed wireless.
Mhm.
Um, so let's talk about some of the things we've talked about. The power level of a cell phone is 1.6 watts. We know dot one is a Bluetooth signal. We also talked about small cell sites, 5G small cell sites. They are roughly 40 watts. And those 40 watts are omnidirectional. It means it goes in every direction. And so now I'm going to answer your question. With you have a fixed satellite transmission, you have roughly 100 to 140 watts to get to the satellite. You have to have that kind of power to get top within those miles that has to uh, cover. They have to go a long way. And the only way they do that is with a heavy, heavy power level, 100 to 140 watts. That's unprecedented power levels in your backyard. They are literally can be in your backyard, and because they're omnidirectional, uh, to a great extent, there's a parabola that drives it directly, but there is a residual that occurs, and that's unprecedented in your uh, area of living. Your neighborhood is now potentially has very heavy power level transmitters that you've not seen in your environment before. So I'm not too keen on it, only
Now,
because I don't
was
think
this
we know
sort
enough.
of approved by an international regulatory body that these satellites could be put up there? I mean, it's a
Oh
great
yeah,
idea that providing internet coverage everywhere, that's great. But the fact that we're all being
yeah,
irradiated, that's
yeah. That wasn't a consideration.
hmm.
My I believe because if you really thought about it, Why would you expose the user of a device um, um, that would be known to be dangerous in its use? So I'm not sure why that makes sense. It does help in so many ways, but it does introduce complications to the human body.
So what are the top main symptoms that can be associated with EHS?
Okay, so you have, I don't know, depression, tinnitus, ringing in your ears. Um, you have insomnia, fatigue, dizziness, body aches, tension, stress, burning sensations. It could be sleep disorders, memory concentration. It could, there are just so many headaches. A simple headache could be from the router sitting next to your head. And you just don't realize that there is um, a power within your environment that's influencing the cells of your body to the point where it's disrupting those cells. So there are so many of the EHS symptoms that can get pretty serious. Even the anxiety and depression that we have in high schools today, it's almost unprecedented at the levels they're at. And there's been some studies that show a direct correlation to RF, radio frequency signals, but it's not substantiated with sufficient evidence, statistically significant evidence for that to be an understood problem. And that's sort of the problem. It's hard to get others to understand this is potentially more serious than it is because it's just simply not. In fact, the way I describe it, by the way, is that the only way we're going to get the governments to think about this is take 10,000 children and put them in one room and another 10,000 in another room, radiate the 10,000 in the first room, and then give organic food and eat healthy in the other room. And then after a few years, decide based on the study who got sick and who didn't, what was the seriousness of the illness. That would be a controlled environment that would give us research study results that we could use. But that's never going to happen. And I don't think it ever will happen until we have a common knowledge through years of experience that we ultimately all realize that it's potentially dangerous.
Now, there was this study in France where I think one of the schools they actually eradicated Wi-Fi from the school.
Oh, they have.
Yeah.
Spain. There's actually several that's done that. And which I read a couple of studies recently. One was on it was under 20 hertz. It's used in science often for medical purposes. And what they concluded from the study was that there was emotional depression associated with the exposures. And it was a well-run study. And then in Germany, I read another one recently. In Germany, there were hormonal changes in the sequence of a cell. In other words, they would change the sequence numbering. And that's something that is far beyond hypersensitivity. You're talking about genetics at this point. And I've talked about genetics in the past, but here we have evidence recently from Germany that's showing that if you're near a cell tower, depending on how close you are, you could have a mutated cell. In other words, you can have a Down syndrome child directly related to a sequence change that occurred from that exposure. And so we know that science is learning more and more about the implications. This particular research showed something I haven't seen before. Others maybe have, but I hadn't seen it. And that really is explaining a lot of what we see in our environment with ADHD and all the other kinds of challenges we have.
And do you think doctors are aware of EHS? I mean, if an
No,
individual visits the
no.
hospital and they say they have a headache, would
Yeah,
they?
no, yeah, right. They say, hey, two aspirin and come back next week. They don't look at the environmental impacts, which is, of course, so important to the human race since day one. The environment is impacting and we evolved based on that external influences. And we know we've had difficulty um, taking the information we know and the science we've developed around this technology into the medical community so they have a better understanding of how to treat a patient. Now, given that I said that, we've actually worked with clinics and they have actually um, helped um, with changing their clinics to be electrohypersensitive clinics, believe it or not. So it's slowly occurring, in my opinion. Um, Maybe not quick enough, but finally, I think we're starting to, and it was all started because of 5G. People started questioning what is 5G and what does it mean to us?
We have a few testimonials on our website where we conducted interviews with people with EHS. And most of them said that when they visited a conventional doctor, they were just sort of either sent back or be sort of sent to a psychiatrist, basically.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely true. There was one, Dr. EMF is a buddy of mine, and um, he had a patient. The patient could not walk, and he was in a very, very high voltage exposure, and it debilitated his body to the extent where he was couldn't walk. And so it took probably 6 months through protocol. They developed protocols for identifying exposures from electric magnetic exposures, and they went through that protocol. They they found that when he was walking, his brain pattern was a sleeping brain pattern, and vice versa. So it was affecting his brain. It was affecting his body, his motor function. All of the aspects of the human body had been it. So when he was removed from the environment he was involved with, working, he actually improved. And it took probably almost 2 years for him to recover from that environment. Typically, when you start getting exposed, you actually get worse with exposures before you get better. So it's always wise to try to recognize what those exposures are and try to mitigate them as much as you can.
How has your life been impacted by EHS or EMF, basically?
Oh, well, again, I worked for Bell Labs. I mean, I worked in the technology space for my whole life, and yet I was unaware of the implications to the human body. What what when I began investigating it and finding there was a gap between the technology manufacturing uh, and and the science about the impact, I basically it became my life's work. I really began trying to find ways of helping people understand what the problems are and what they could do about it to help mitigate the implications of the human body. And so for me, it really changed fundamentally what I did as a human. And I think it's an important pathway that I've taken because it's not often true that you can have people involved that really do understand the technologies and has the capacity to understand the science associated with it.
And how was your experience when working at that telecom company? I mean, were there towers within that specific vicinity? And
Actually, I always tell the story about mainframes.
mhm.
I had a mainframe that was several hundred feet from my office, and of course, I wasn't impacted by it. But the emissions from that were were a lot. And now I have it in my pocket. The power of a mainframe is now in your pocket. And so exposure over the last many years has really evolved. And I was part of all that work. And my colleagues were part of that work. Some of them are still involved at senior levels of these companies. And they have a differing opinion than I have. Um, Mine, I think, was through education that I sort of drove myself to. They chose not to. So I just think it's a long path that people need to learn as much as they can about it and not rely on others to tell them about it.
Where do you think the most EMF is emitted from?
Actually, starting out, the most that's impacting you are the technologies that are in your room. For example, your living room has a certain level of cell phones, laptops, tablets, all having transmitters. And then you have your bedroom where you have voltage running through your cables. And there's emissions coming off the extremely low frequency emissions coming off of those wires. And then you have your cell phone, maybe at your nightstand. And I consider it extremely important that all of those kinds of conditions are cleared up. So you create a sanctuary to minimize the exposures, particularly when you sleep, because that's when you recover. Your mitochondrial recovery, all those kinds of things happen when you are sleeping at night. So it's really true that you really need to think about each room and the exposures throughout the day and what's best for you.
What can an average individual sort of do to protect themselves from EHS,
Um,
EMF?
yeah, again, I really do think there are actions you can take. Think about it as time, distance, and shielding. Think of those three things and when you go into any environment using any technologies. Think of time, distance, and shielding. If you have a lot of time on the technologies, try to shield. If you're not as much, don't worry about it. It's like you really need to decide what are the actions that you need to take to try to create that sanctuary, as an example, in the bedroom. How do you create the wiring to your TV so it's not on Wi-Fi? What are the things you can do to turn off those transmitters? How do you get the bees in a room to be less and less and less?
And what about EMF protective clothing?
Yes, I actually think it's a wise idea. Um, if you have an environment where there are lots of bees in the room, then you may benefit from clothing, and because those are RF conductors typically, and they take the power and they dissipate into the clothing. And some are better than others. So you want to investigate as much as you can to see who has the better choice. But I actually think it works pretty well. It protects the organs, which is important.
Now, there's the Schumann resonance, which is around 7.83 hertz, which is like a natural EMF that's emitted.
Yeah, right. Yeah. That's a DC signal, by the way.
Mhm.
It's not AC. It's not alternating current. And so, and in fact, I mentioned earlier that I was looking at a study about roughly 10 hertz and below. That is the Schumann resonance. That range, it actually goes up to 12. And that the human body has learned how to deal with very well because that's been in their environment, the human's environment since the earth started. So I don't think there's any concern on the human impact to that 10 hertz or below necessarily. What I worry about is when the medical community uses power on those low end signals that increase the implications to the human body because they don't really understand the implications. And we know, like, as I mentioned, depression was one of the side effects of those exposures.
How can EMF be harmful to ecology? Now, we know for a fact that it impacts birds, well, migratory birds, which can sort of alter their direction of travel and leading to them dying, basically. Is
Right.
there any other way that EMF impacts ecology?
Oh, I have a buddy of mine, Ollie Johansson. He's one of the uh, finest experts from Sweden on electric hypersensitivity. And he showed an experiment once where he took a cell phone and he put it in front of an ant hill. And the ants took the babies out of that location and moved them. He turned it off and they moved back. It was like it impacts nature. And as you just mentioned, using it for flight location is often used by many of the um, species in our environment. And so there's no question that we see that, in particularly with fifth generation stuff, where the power levels are higher, that there'll be greater impact to the birds, particularly, and other living beings.
What further research do you think needs to be conducted in this area?
What further? Oh, that's one of those things that really disturbs me. They do a scientific study and they say they need more because it's not statistically significant. But when you look at the metadata, when you look at cross studies, there's such a preponderance of support demonstrating danger. I just think people need to pay attention, not necessarily look for more data. There's more than ample data if you look at the metadata, that is, multiple studies in a similar space. And the only kind of data that you need beyond where we already are is the school children study that I mentioned before, which will never happen. Why? Because we're not going to intentionally hurt children and or humans for that matter. So, in my opinion, we have certainly enough, and we should be looking at it at a cumulative level. We should be looking at it at a metadata level, and that should be more than enough driving what we do as a human species.
Now, if there is a petition that I'm pretty sure there are many petitions regarding this social cause that have been held before. I'm not sure if any of these companies or any government has actually answered that question of
No, and they
some
won't.
YouTube.
Yeah, that won't happen. And I wouldn't expect it. Um, in my opinion, it is something that I don't control. Um, I have intentionally set out to help people understand the problem and give them some suggestions on what they may want to do in their own lives. And that's something you do control. And that's my coaching. If I wait for the FCC in the US to change the standard, it will the FCC was brought to court by several um, leading scientists in the US questioning the standards of developed in 1996. Um, they lost in court. The FCC lost in court, but it was on a technicality where they did not look at the data of the current time. It wasn't that they did the wrong thing. They did a they did not by law look at the evidence existing at the time. My guess is it'll be 5 to 10 years likely before we see any change. So it's not going to be, even with that pressure, even losing court, I'm not sure there's going to be much change.
What if there's about, let's say there's a city and there are a million people who have signed the petition. Now, it's sort of
I don't
rules
think
of,
that will happen.
Mhm.
I just don't, that from a practical point of view, all of us have been involved. You win your battles and control those battles to some extent, but you're not going to win a war necessarily. There's other dynamics that will occur, and it may be, believe it or not, the technologies may evolve to the point where they're less invasive to the human.
Mhm.
And by the time you succeed in your formal attack on your governments, the technology themselves may evolve to the point where they're less dangerous, and we no longer have the problem. Look, trans fats um, were considered a hazard 30 to 40 years after they became available. And everyone was saying that the cholesterol you were getting from the eggs is going to kill you. It was the trans fat they were cooking your French fries in that had more of an impact than the eggs you were eating. And so it took over 40 years for it to be banned in Europe. And it took over 40 plus years to get banned in the US. It was only banned last year in the US. It existed for many, many, many years, but accumulated data ultimately changed the environment. And there was enough evidence at that time to make it a change in Europe and a change in the US.
That's very interesting. Have
Yep.
you sort of heard of scalar waves?
Um, I don't know if I have.
They were initially discovered by Nikola Tesla in the 1800s, and they're sort of a different type of wave as compared to electromagnetic waves.
Yeah, I actually talked about there are actually several technologies that I'm aware of, which is a different transmit.
Mhm.
And it's not omnidirectional. There's all sorts of different things about it, which are I I know there's trials going on with some of these technologies, and they will be an improvement if they're successful.
Now, what if
Um,
there's a new technology and well, the industry is so sort of stubborn in the sense of, this is profit making, especially in the telecom industry.
right. In fact, that's a dynamic I mentioned before.
Hmm.
It's the cost effectiveness of it. There may
Yeah.
be there's technologies today that we know we can implement in our transmitters. We can use directional transmitters on a parabola using a parabola for your omnidirectional RF signal today, but it's not done. It's a cost associated with a cell phone or other devices that makes it unlikely to be incorporated into the technologies we use today.
And what do you
I'm
think
hopeful
of
that changes, but it won't necessarily.
frequency-based medicine, sort of to prevent EHS?
There is technology being used right now, which is um, vibration.
Mhm.
And I actually think vibration is promising because it's a resonance that occurs that's a specific frequency, but it's physically a very different. It doesn't have any electrical component. It doesn't have a magnetic component. And I actually think it's promising. It's been used throughout the world, actually, more so in Europe than the US. And I think it's promising. Um, so there are these technologies coming about that is sort of a variation of what we're talking about, but they are more effective and less harmful. So from that point, I think it's a good thing.
Mm. Are there any sort of natural supplements that somebody can implement to ease the symptoms of EHS?
Yeah. Um, I actually developed a company that does that. I
Mhm.
got frustrated from the supplement industry that they weren't quite. I'll give you an example. When you have EHS, you're more likely not to have a DevC microbiome. It's a very specific microbiome, and not all spores actually affect that particular biome. So we have a product that we created that goes after that microbiome, and it is a supplement that is specifically designed down to the cellular level to help those who are electric hypersensitive. A very, very strong vitamin component we have as well, which has antioxidants in it, not only the typical stuff, but antioxidants as well. And that's strictly for electric hypersensitive. And something that everyone knows about, including you, omega. Omega is one of the finest. A pure omega can give the human body inflammation a run for its money. It actually helps the body with that inflammation that occurs from these kind of exposures. So there are um, supplements that actually can help. And I'll talk about an eye. Um, when you look at a monitor, there's a blue light coming off that monitor, and it is going through the eye down to the macula. And so it is creating premature macular degeneration as a result of the blue light exposure. When you look at a monitor, you don't blink. Your eyes are open, so you get dry eye. So there are symptoms associated with some of the technologies we use that are very specific. And our eye product, for example, we actually filter blue light with a compound inside. We actually help the macula build out as a result of the exposures. We actually have component in the to generate a wet eye. So we have a specifically things we went after, and it's called the company we have is Light Body, and it was specifically designed for electro hypersensitive and others exposed to these technologies.
Now, how many people do you think in the world are sort of impacted by EMF, but they just don't really know the term or basically how to understand when they're impacted by EMF?
Remember, I mentioned to you Dr. EMF.
Hmm.
Okay, Dr. EMF did not know he was electric hypersensitive until he read my book, which is A Radiation Nation. He just did not know the symptoms to look for. And so he's not the only one. Most people don't realize that the symptom they have is correlated to the exposures they're in. And doctors simply don't know that there's that correlation. Uh, but again, slowly but surely, people are being influenced. and more they're getting more aware of what they should be aware of.
Because for most of the population, a phone is just a phone, and they're
Oh, well, I told you, 50% of everyone you see statistically have some form of symptom. They get headaches when they get near it. Their eyes or their ears ring, tendonitis. Uh, so this is not a debate. We know from many science studies that up to 50% now. It used to be 10 to 20%. Now it's up to 15 with some of the studies I've seen. So it is wide, worldwide, exposing so many of us, and it seems to be growing.
Is there anything you would like to add in regards to sort of telling the world about EHS or EMF?
Yeah, I'll repeat it again. You're the architect of your own destiny. You should not be waiting for someone else to help you figure this out. You really need to understand um, in your environment if this is impacting you or not. And if you consider it true, you should take action based on experts to help you try to understand the problem. But there's a lot out there, there's things to know. But again, you're the architect, no one else is. So you have to take the action. You want to protect your children, you have to take the action. You want to protect your family, you have to take the action. No one else will.
So Fique is, let me tell you a bit more about Fique. It's a clothing brand that incorporated silver fabric or
Yep,
EMF protective fabric within its garments. And
yep,
we're sort of trying to build the community of individuals who can be, who basically are EHS or
yep,
any individual in general who wants to be part of this social cause. So we
yep.
also created a film. It's called The Silver Lining, which sort of tries to incorporate these symptoms, this information into a very entertaining film.
Good, good.
Because most people aren't really into watching a documentary that's very
Right,
in-depth into this. So that's meant to be for the general public.
right,
And the Fique Foundation is, we're sort of conducting research and development into alternative ways of protecting individuals because it's also not the most convenient way to always have EMF protective clothing.
right,
If
right,
somebody is, just wants to relax at home.
right,
And
right.
that's where scalar waves and this and that sort of comes in.
Good, good, good.
And it would be great if we can collaborate because as many people, you know, pushing out this social cause, bringing awareness to people, the better
Oh
it is
yeah.
for humanity.
Oh yeah. I wrote the book out of frustration. It's a pretty well-known book on this subject because no one else was selling the story.
Would it be okay if we sort of promote your book on our website?
Oh,
And
of course. Yeah. Yeah. It's people learn what it is, the basics, the history, what EHS is. We try to provide a cross-sectional understanding of all these sort of industry standards, where they are, what started them.
um, if you would like to collaborate in any other way, please let us know. And
Okay.
it would be great to shake hands and, get the mission as fast as possible to the people.
Yep. Very good. Very good.
Thank you very much for your time, and it was,
Thank you. I appreciate you inviting me, and you have a wonderful day.
thank you.